Welcome to this episode of the Phoenix Conversations. Second chances, fresh starts, and powerful new chapters. I'm Lucy Macara, and I'm delighted to be talking to Joseph McGUIRE today. Joseph has taught the ancient Chinese skill of face reading, mian xiang, and body language since 1985, initially to healthcare professionals as agnostic and communication tools. He qualified and practiced as a holistic therapist in several modalities for 30 years. But in recent years, he has added skills from the fields of negotiation, interrogation, and elicitation. Now his primary focus is on assisting clients with C-level interviewing and behavioural negotiation skills, and he's passionate about helping women uncover the real character, intentions, and motivation of the men they're dating. And during this fascinating career, Joseph has been through a number of life reinventions. So, hello, Joseph, and thank you very much for joining me on the Phoenix Conversations.
Hello, Lucy. Thank you so much for the invitation.
It's really exciting to have you here, and there's so much I want to unpack with you. But I'd like to start at the beginning. In your childhood, where were you brought up? What was your childhood like? And what were the intimations that you had of your skills and abilities that started in childhood?
Yes, I was brought up in Ireland, in Dublin. Grew up in a very conservative Irish Catholic family in a very conservative society. And I would say I had a sense of not quite fitting in from a very early age. I was able to read people from as early as I can remember. I do have memories of sitting on the floor at my parents' home, probably before I could even speak, and knowing that I knew quite a bit about the adults around me. And I mean, my uncles or my aunts or my father's work colleagues who may have visited. I don't mean like their deep, dark secrets, but I knew who was being real and who wasn't and who was faking it, all that stuff. So that's where I started.
Did you realise that was something that not everybody could do? Or did you, like many children, just assume this was, everybody could do this, it was completely normal?
Yes, I assumed everybody. If it was so obvious to me, it must be obvious to everybody else. And my father used to bring me to soccer matches as a child. I can actually remember him carrying a wooden crate on his shoulder so that I could stand on it so I could actually see over the side of the pitch. And I could see the patterns of play before they developed. I could tell who was confident, who was shirking, whose head dropped, and all of those things. And again, it was so blatantly obvious to me. It can't be just me because it's so obvious. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized, I'm seeing and hearing and picking up on things that most people are not getting at all. And I actually lost my confidence probably around the age of 7. Like I wasn't horribly treated or any of that a lot of people unfortunately have experienced, just a series of emotional challenges. And so I became very quiet. And I did a lot of observing, and in retrospect, I could see many years later that this was part of my apprenticeship as well, because I was spending a lot of time observing and listening, where a lot of people were busy talking and making noise and being very sociable. I had friends, but I was the strong silent type.
So would you say that in a sense that was your first reinvention, a lack of confidence kind of almost changed who you presented as?
Yes, because in the very early years of childhood, I was actually very outgoing, and there would have been a lot of family parties, and I would always be called on to do whatever my party piece was, and I would be happy to sing or whatever. And I can remember playing table tennis, again, probably when I was 4 or 5, and singing at the table. But once my confidence went, I literally just stayed quiet. I refused to sing, and if I even tried to sing, my throat would just tighten up. So that was definitely the switch off, as it were. And it wasn't until many years later that the confidence started to develop. And that was really when I left Ireland.
And what age were you when you left Ireland? And what took you to wherever you went to?
I was 23, so it was quite a long period of being quiet. And I went to Israel. I went to spend time on a kibbutz. I'd known many people who'd been there and had wonderful adventures. And I've been an avid reader since childhood. That was one gift my parents gave me, the gift of reading. And I'd read a lot of history, social history, etc. And because of our history in Ireland, of being a colonized people and all of that, I identified with the struggle for Israel to form and the Holocaust and all of the horrors around that. Israel was like a beacon for me. So when I went to Israel, I was then exposed to the world in a totally different way, because I was coming from a very monocultural society where we were in recession anyway as well, which didn't help. And now I was meeting people from so many different backgrounds. I had to come out of myself. And if you've ever dealt with Israelis, you know they're, no pun intended, in your face. They're very direct. And if you don't meet them in that space, then they just kind of ignore you or they push you aside. And that's just a statement of fact. That's not any kind of judgment. But it brought me out of myself in a really positive way. And then I was in a country where there was colour, because you were seeing sunshine and blue skies and colours changing on the hills around the Jordan Valley, and then having to communicate differently, or having to communicate first of all, but having to communicate differently just demanded that I come out of myself and that I engage with people in a way I'd never done before. So that was where the world opened up, really.
And so that was that, we would say, your next reinvention, really. What were you doing on the kibbutz?
I was picking cotton, picking bananas, picking avocados, working briefly, you had to do a compulsory week in a particular factory, and you'd be getting up at 4 a.m, probably not having slept, and you'd be very careful because you were dealing with these hot, like literally red hot valves. And if you didn't catch them in time, you were going to get badly burnt. So it was a variety of different things. Part of the fun, part of the pleasure was actually the more physical activity, like the picking bananas. And you were doing that for 8-10 hours a day. And because of the people I was working with, most of them were actually Australian. Australians can be quite direct, and their sense of humor can be very raw. So again, it demanded I came out of myself, and it was just huge fun.
That sounds like a really positive kind of reinvention period. And were you using your skills during that kind of quite physical working period? Had you become a practitioner of what you now do at all by then?
No, that was the next step. When I left Israel, I moved to London, and that was when I had been introduced to whole foods before I left Ireland. And I'd been given addresses in London where I could follow up this interest, because the change of diet transformed my energy. I had always been physically fit, but the change of diet brought me to a point where it felt like a waste of time going to bed at night because I had so much energy. And I knew I wanted to follow up on this because it was so powerful. So I had addresses in London to follow up. And when I moved there, I went to this particular centre for a meal, and I got chatting to a chap across the table. He told me he was there from Denmark to do a course. He didn't tell me what the course was about, but a guy came over to the table. My new friend called him over, pointed at me and said, "This man wants to do the course." The course was starting that evening. And for some reason I said yes. And that was the beginning of actually learning the skills of reading faces, reading body language. So this is where I began to get a structure to allow me to explain what I was doing, even though it wasn't strictly speaking what I was doing, but the structure helped to open up conversations.
Did you then realise that the abilities that you'd had as a child and, continuing, did you realise at that point that was something special now that you had a structure to put it into, a format, if you like, to develop?
Yes, I think I did. But I was also meeting more people who were engrossed in this as well. So this became a normal conversation, where in the past I couldn't probably have spoken too freely with people about it, because they would have, what's that about? Because that just wasn't part of the environment I grew up in. But now this was a normal conversation. So it opened me up. It gave me more confidence. It allowed me to, again, engage with people in a different way, communicate in a different way. So it freed up a lot of the inner resources, for want of a better term. And that was then that was then the prelude to the next stage of reinvention, to actually starting to formally practice as a therapist.
Tell us about that. That sounds fascinating.
Yes, I met this German lady in London, in the same place we were studying, and her best friend married the director of a centre in Hamburg, which was like a smaller version of the place we studied, and they were looking for people to come and work there. So we decided, let's do that. Now, I didn't speak German at the time, so the only two words of German I spoke at that stage were words you don't use in relation to the war. So I had to learn to speak German from scratch. But the work was there because they had an established centre, and they actually had a contract with the local university to teach, I think, 3 classes a week. And I was handed that. So I was working initially with a translator, but after 11 months there, I was teaching the classes myself in German. So that was the next stage between going to Germany, beginning to learn German, and then actually starting to practice as a therapist and trainer. So several pieces blended together.
Several big pieces of reinvention, in as much as not just a practitioner, but a trainer, a teacher as well, which seems to me always a big thing to the reinvention journey, learning to teach your skills to other people.
Yes, it reminds me of a George Bernard Shaw quote. We teach the things we mostly need to learn. And I can imagine on reflection that some of the first presentations I gave were absolutely dreadful, because I'd never taught or presented anything before on any topic, any subject, any language. So sometimes you fly by the seat of your pants.
I'm fascinated by the intrinsic skill that you have. Do you ever find yourself overwhelmed by knowing too much? I mean, for instance, if you're teaching a class and you're able to read all the students who are there, does it ever feel like too much that, you have to kind of somehow put filters on?
Yes, I've had numerous occasions where I can see that some people have been carrying huge trauma, and I have to be very careful, very diplomatic about what I say, how I say it. And it may be that the particular subject matter does involve trauma or pain, and I have to be very delicate in terms of how I phrase it. Maybe put it in the form of a question rather than a statement, and then I'll be paying attention to people's reactions, not just their facial expression, but changes in breathing patterns, changes in whether the jaw tightens, things like that, which will tell me a lot about what's going on for them in the moment.
So can you describe, I know it would probably be very lengthy if you did, but can you sort of summarize what you are able to do that you now realize that other people can't? So you talked about sort of parts of facial recognition, but obviously there's more to it than that. And do you understand what it is that's happening, or is it something that is, kind of almost coming to you from elsewhere?
That's a deep question. Yes, I would say I have a better understanding, and I don't know that there is an elsewhere, because the more I've studied, not just in terms of the craft, as it were, but the more I've looked into ancient spiritual traditions and even aspects of quantum physics, and not so much the quantum physics itself, but the lives of some of the most eminent physicists over the last century, like Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Schrödinger, for example. They've all acknowledged the influence that the reading of the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Indian scriptures, had on their understanding of physics. So there's a lot of complementarity there. And one of the things that Schrödinger referred to, how he described it, is there's one singularity phasing, which he was talking about. There's only one consciousness. Now, this may be getting into kind of sound very abstract, but I just see myself as part of a greater whole. And so really, as much as anything else, for me to do what I do to best effect and to be of benefit to people, I have to get out of the way and let go of any assumptions and just let the skills be there and the awareness be there as best I can. So I can explain the technicalities of facial detail in terms of what I'm seeing and what it means for the person, etc. One of the biggest influences on my life really has been once I saw the Chinese symbol for listening. It includes, logically enough, the ears, but it also includes the eyes, and it also includes the heart and the mind, and all of those faculties working together in tandem. So once I got that, it made so much sense to me, because really the whole body is an instrument. The whole body is continually transmitting and receiving. We just in most cases not recognize that, or being trained out of it because we're operating from, as we used to say, the top 2 inches, and we second guess ourselves. But our bodies are receiving so much information about the person we meet or the people we're meeting. And when we're open to that, when we're in tune to that, we can receive so much and actually understand a lot about them. And I mean that in a positive way, in terms of how to connect with them, or in some cases, better not to connect at all.
Yes, you must have found, apart from understanding people's positive traits and experiences, presumably you have also come across negative ones that you wouldn't have wanted to interact with.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm probably, at this stage, I'm grateful that I did. And thankfully, I didn't get hooked in, but I can see I've met quite a number of people who have been very badly treated in their lives, whether in intimate relationships, business relationships, etc. And I would have a far better understanding of how to recognize those traits, the non-desirable traits, and how to spot them quickly, and be better skilled at advising people how to walk away from them.
So I don't want to jump forward too much, but I know there are some really fascinating parts of your story. So we're kind of in Germany and you're teaching at the moment, but at some stage you go and work for the FBI, you start to work with big corporates, but you're also working with women to help them understand the relationships that they should and should not perhaps be getting into. So where were the reinvention points for all these kind of steps forward?
Yes, one clarification. I haven't worked with or for the FBI. I have trained with former FBI trainers, because I don't know that the FBI would allow me actually in the door. But that's a that's a separate thing. But I've been very fortunate to have been able to train with former FBI trainers who have shared such precise and profound skills that I wouldn't have had access to through my own background. I guess the next stage of the reinvention was actually leaving Germany, because after 2.5 years there, I think it was, my father died in Ireland, and that was a massive shock. And so we hadn't intended to stay in Germany anyway, but it just made sense to leave, and Ireland seemed to be the logical place to come to. So I had to start from scratch in Ireland, start from the absolute beginning again, and build something completely fresh. And over time, then I started bringing in more of the face reading, body language, and training more. And I was moving away from using it in a therapeutic context, because I had learned it as a diagnostic tool. And I was bringing in more of the personality, communication style, character reading, all of that, which was actually far more interesting to me anyway. And so I started doing more workshops, seminars, etc. And over a period of time, I was then introduced to business networking. So I had to, again, change my presentation, change my identity in many ways, because I'd always seen my identity as being the therapist. And now, and even though my practice was a business, it was a successful business, I hadn't thought of myself as a business person. But now, when I started doing business networking, I had to see myself in a business context, speak business language, meet people in the context of KPIs, ROIs, et cetera, et cetera. I learned that a number of people in the US had been using these skills in the business world and in the legal world. So I started to look at what they were doing, developed a model, and then started doing training for bigger organizations here, whether, pharma, aviation, financial services, et cetera, et cetera. And that, again, that opened things up, because I came from more the holistic side of things. I was always a little bit wary of big business. So when I started to meet these people as people, I realized, yeah, they are just people. And in retrospect, it sounds a little bit strange, but that was an adjustment I had to make. And I realized I was having fun, and I was being of benefit to them. I was showing them how they could communicate to far greater effect than they had been doing in many cases, by just simple observations. And it was, that was another stage of transformation.
It must have been transformational for your business for a start. It must have been a very different kind of market that you were now serving. And as you say, you had to transform yourself and your perception of yourself as someone who was a holistic practitioner, as you say, and now a business practitioner. And presumably you've now kind of got those aligned and feel comfortable with that.
Yes. And when we went into lockdown a few years ago, that's when the world both closed down and then opened up because everything went online. And so I was meeting so many people from so many different cultures, different nationalities, and different business backgrounds. So again, there had to be an opening up, another sort of leap forward in terms of my communication, my presentation. And I had to demonstrate that I could still do what I did, even I was just, when you're just seeing it like a head or just shoulders, etc., but also to present myself in a way that was coherent and convincing to people that they got it. And it's a constant process because we're seeing the world changing so rapidly anyway, and we're certainly seeing it in business with the advent of AI and the digitization of so many things. So I've had to be so much clearer and so much more precise in how I communicate in a business context. And it has to be impactful quickly. Before, we were more accustomed to taking time to listen, to pay attention. Now it's bang, 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 bang. And I came across one study not that long ago where, certainly in Europe, the average time that a person takes or is comfortable with silence is 8 seconds. And it's probably gone down since that study came out. And people talk about the attention span, concentration span being less than that of a goldfish. So you have to learn to communicate and to be present in a much more impactful way. And sometimes that actually does mean not speaking, but being present and enabling people to feel heard. That's probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned in life, is that one of our primary needs is to feel heard, not to be heard, but to feel heard, because it gives us a sense of safety. It gives us a sense of peace. It gives us a sense of security that, wow, somebody's actually listened to me. Somebody's actually heard me, because it's happening less and less in life now. So when we can convey that we have heard, we have really heard, not just what they say, but where they're coming from when they say it. That's a big part of how we impact on people.
So, Joseph, when you sit in an interview room, say in a big corporate organisation, and you're helping let's say the CEO or, the senior team pick a new hire for their business, what exactly are you doing and who are you making feel heard? Are you helping the interviewee to get themselves across, or are you totally on the side, as it were, of the hirers?
I have helped some people prepare for interviews, but I'm mainly on the side of the hirers. And I don't need to know the technicalities of the role, but I do need to meet the interview panel beforehand. And I do need to get a read of them, but I also will give them instructions so that they understand if I speak during the interview, there's a reason for it, and they have to stay quiet. And when the candidate answers, I then stay quiet. The panel stays quiet because there's a reason for my sustained silence. And the questions I ask and the facial expressions I use when I'm asking the questions will be very focused and there'll be a very specific reason for them, because I've heard or noticed something in the candidate that isn't gelling. And when somebody comes in for an executive interview, they're going to be practiced, they're going to be polished, they're going to be quite articulate. You have to expect that. But I'm there to get behind that surface, behind the mask, because the company needs to know whether this person is really going to be able to perform. And as they used to say in financial services ads, past performance is no guarantee of future results. You have to know whether somebody's going to be able to perform under pressure. And I have to bring some of that out in the interview. So part of that is using some of the interrogation skills I've learned in training. But interrogation it's a word we typically associate with the movies and the crime shows we've seen on TV or big screen. But the best interrogation is actually gentle. It's actually quiet, and it's first and foremost establishing rapport. And when you establish rapport, then people will reveal more.
So I guess, in fact, if you are finding out that somebody's not appropriate for a role, that you are actually doing both sides a favour. You're not actually just on one side because it could not work out for the other person as well.
Absolutely. And it still shocks me that the consistent global failure rate over the last 10 years for executive appointments in the first 18 months is between 40 and 70%. And I see the same mistakes cropping up time and time and time again, that there are all sorts of glitches in the recruitment process. And then so many interviewers don't know how to interview. And so I'm there to bring something more precise to the process.
I don't know if you've ever watched The Traitors, the TV programme, but that is a masterclass in how we all think we have incredible intuition and we can tell what people are like. And actually, we can't. Most of us are hopeless. So you bring something that is really uncanny in a sense. I know it's rooted in absolute science and a reality, but in a way, it feels uncanny to the people who cannot do that. Are you able to give any examples of in dangerous situations, if you like, that you have picked up on and avoided for people?
Yeah, I can give you two examples. Typically, the way things work is the candidate doesn't know who I am. I'm introduced as a colleague or an associate. So that's the first thing. They've no idea who I am. I will then, in some cases, I may not even speak during the interview. I will just be observing. But either way, I will write up a profile at the end. And I make it very, very clear. I do not say do or don't hire the person. What I do say is if you hire them, this is how they're likely to behave. And these are particular traits to look out for. Two examples I immediately come to mind of interviews where the companies hired the person when I pointed out several red flags. One where I very quickly discerned that the guy had misogynistic traits. The company needed somebody with particular technical skills, and they chose this guy. But I made it very clear this guy is likely to be misogynistic, and one of the partners was actually female. And a couple of months later, they came back to me and said, "You were spot on. We had to get rid of him." The other one was an interview for the chief auditor position in a financial services company in Dublin, and as it happens, the internal candidate was chosen, and I said that he overestimated his own intelligence, didn't pay attention to detail, and had problems delegating. All of those things you'd think would be kind of essential for a chief auditor. That was November. Christmas Eve, one of his team spotted a major thing this guy had overlooked and corrected it. And if he hadn't done it on Christmas Eve like that, the company would have lost their license to trade at a cost of some 20 million euro. Now, the CEO read the profile and said, yes, I knew all this about him, but I thought he would change.
Amazing. For the people who you do take your advice, you must be making or saving them millions of pounds or dollars. Extraordinary.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like when you think of that statistic of the 40 to 70% failure rate, the cost of hiring the wrong person at that level is astronomical. And it's not just financial, because you're getting key people leaving the company, you're getting customers being dissatisfied, you're getting team morale dropping, you're getting absenteeism increasing, you're getting presenteeism, which is really destructive, where people are just coming in and barely going through the minimum. They've no interest. So the costs are absolutely phenomenal. For some reason, people keep making the same mistakes.
So is there another reinvention on the cards for you, Joseph? Are you happy where you are at the moment and doing what you're doing, or are you looking to any future changes?
Yeah, there are always future changes. That's part of the joy. That's part of the adventure of life. I couldn't imagine retiring. I couldn't imagine stopping. I'm living in Dublin now. I intend to be living in Italy in the next couple of years. And business-wise, some of the work that's been coming to me that I wasn't particularly looking for, but is actually working more with women in their private relationships. Because I've had so many female friends over the years who come to me after the fact of having been badly, or in some cases horrendously treated by men. And to me, men are by and large simple creatures, easy to read. So I can help women read identify the green and the red flags. So I'm currently writing a book on that and putting a whole sort of series of things together in that space. I'm also working on a series of collaborations which are aimed at business leaders. So I love variety. So there's always reinvention in process.
I really, really look forward to that book. You just made me think, is it is it possible to say, is it easier to read men, as you have just suggested, than women, or is that just a sort of a joke?
No, I wouldn't say it's easier because we're all human. And I've initially I would have had certain doubts about whether I could read people from different races, like people, different African countries, for example, where now I've engaged with so many, and I've realized, oh yes, once I know the patterns, it's easier. And no, I don't say it's easier to read men, but if I can help women, because that's something I feel very, very strongly about, that we actually need more women, confident, strong women in prominent roles, in leadership roles. So if women are not having to deal with the stresses of, is this the right guy, or is he, because our private stresses do leak into our professional lives. So if I can play some role in helping more women be in that place of clarity and confidence and bring themselves forward into positions of leadership, then to me, I'm providing some very valuable service.
You certainly are. Yes, that's absolutely wonderful. So finally, Joseph, if anybody is on the brink of change or reinvention, whether they chose it or didn't choose it, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, take a breath. That's the first thing. It's the first. It sounds so obvious, but take a breath. Make sure to give yourself a little bit of space to do something purely for pleasure, whatever that might be, purely for pleasure, just to celebrate yourself as you are, whatever the circumstances. And it doesn't have to be anything. I'm not talking about going out and, spending thousands of pounds or euro, whatever. Go and, go to the park, go and meet a friend for a nice coffee, have a nice meal, listen to your favorite music, dance around the kitchen. It can be something incredibly simple, but celebrate who you are. Celebrate the fact that you're still alive, you're still here, and that there are new doors opening, because we can get caught up in the drama and, oh, this has happened, this is terrible, what am I going to do? All that stuff. And I've been there. I've had to work through enough of those myself. But when we celebrate the fact that we're still here, we are still alive, there's always new possibilities. And it's not only that there are new possibilities, the possibilities may be actually far better. That's something I have learned big time, because some of the things I've gone through, like divorce, etc., I thought, this is the end of the world. And not only was it not the end of the world, it was the opening to a wonderful, wonderful new one.
It's brilliant advice, and that is the joy of reinvention. It usually gets better. Joseph McGUIRE, thank you so much. That has been a really fascinating Phoenix conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Lucy. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
I found that conversation fascinating. I'd love to be a fly on the wall or an observer in the room where Joseph assists with interviewing candidates for C-suite roles, seeing how he manages the conversation and what he reads from the faces and body language. Thank you so much for sharing your story of your gifts, your skills and your reinventions, Joseph. If you enjoyed this Phoenix conversation, please like the episode and subscribe to the podcast wherever you access it, on Spotify, Apple or YouTube, or maybe all three. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok and Facebook. Due to my husband's unspellable and unpronounceable name, I am the only Lucy McGUIRE on the internet, and I'd love to hear your reinvention story. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.